Revisiting Virality After Sedgwick by Clare Hemmings, originally produced for the Feminist Review Journal blog series. There are so many reasons for feeling as though one has time-travelled back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, as we experience the coronavirus pandemic and its effects in such divergent ways globally and locally. For many queer people in the West, the association of touch and risk is connected not only with recent outbreaks, Ebola, SARS, BSE, or with sexual violence, Me Too, but with HIV/AIDS. I came of queer age in that period, and so learned desire and barrier methods at the same time, learned of anxiety and its community mediations or transformations at the same time. We could learn a lot from returning to those community contexts where fear was navigated through care and creativity, and through education practices that challenged the associations of risk as attached to people or identities rather than behaviour. I learned to think of family as an extended network of people caring about each other in different ways, often juxtaposed against the families people grew up in and experienced as sites of constraint or homophobic violence. Those times and spaces, for me, the early to mid-1990s on the east and west coasts of the US, were also, of course, spaces of hierarchy and exclusion, of failures to have a community fully committed to eradication of poverty or racism as well as homophobia. And perhaps this moment of viral confrontation, different though it is, presents an opportunity to take another look at the positives of responses to the HIV/AIDS crisis from a perspective that more consistently embeds class, race, gender and sexual inequality as central to our experiences of this health crisis from the start. I could explore that time-travelling feeling from a range of angles, but here I want to hone in on the vertigo caused by the repeated, insistent and easy citation of the household as a place and time to shelter within, as the baseline unit of risk. The household, that unit of analysis as well as description, that could only ever see queer as divergence, single mothers as pathology, migrant remittances as sad necessity, and single living as selfishness. The critique of its logic, as well as its inaccuracy, by feminists and queer theorists, was a trenchant, and for me beloved, critique of both the heterosexual presumption at the heart of the household, but also its classism, racism, and gendered miseries. The queer critique of the household was both that its one-size-fits-all proposition was only ever intended to suit a minority, framed as a majority, and that the resulting heteroparanoia would do anything to ensure it remained safely behind closed doors. Of course, we now know that such a term can be extended to include all sorts of relationships previously excluded, as long as the key criteria of stability, coupledom, and middle-class white aspiration can be convincingly met. But even 3 months ago, who would have anticipated the force with which the household has landed back on us with such an almighty conservative thump? Enter Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who theorised the centrality of sexuality to social meaning so beautifully in Epistemology of the Closet in 1990. Sedgwick centres ignorance and paranoia as the twin motors of the closet mobilised by the powerful. For Sedgwick, knowledge is not a rational progression to increased transparency, but a closeted dynamic that relies on, all the while it denies, its desiring mechanisms. The closet is the open secret through which difference and inequality are both obscured and played out in front of our eyes in plain sight. It's the dynamic that makes you feel like you're going mad when the power abuses taking place are denied or thrown back at you. But it's also what makes people seek different frames of value too, in order to have their accounts of the world reflected in company. The playing out of ignorance worked its deadly logic in relationship to the HIV/AIDS pandemic when Sedgwick was writing Epistemology. She highlighted the protection given to homophobic employers and the medical establishment through a studied lack of information. There are parallels here with contemporary mandates to stay home, all the while the glaring exceptions to people's access to a household as a safe space are trundled in front of our eyes. Migrants and refugees, homeless populations and displaced communities, the health and service sector workers who have to go to work are certainly not a secret. Yet they remain exceptionalised, though not exceptional, in the logic that proposes a minority solution as a universal one. The fact that racial minorities are many times more likely to die from coronavirus in the UK and the US is also no surprise. The racism of income and health disparities are well known. And yet that injustice can still be experienced by white people as new. And further, those of us who are the universalised minority able to shelter at home are encouraged in our paranoid vigilance in respect of those who have no choice but to take up public space in our stead. The anxiety related to stepping outside of the household, then, is consistently in inverse proportion to the actual risk. Sedgwick's epistemology allows us to see these contradictions or shows of deadly ignorance not as undoing how we know and experience coronavirus, but as central to its logics. And no doubt we will also be asked to participate in the obscuring work of pushing knowledge back into the closet once we start to emerge from this most immediate crisis. Thus, Boris Johnson is unlikely to be called to account for his insistent handshaking at an early stage of the crisis before he was admitted to an ICU unit, or for his government's ideological refusal to participate in an EU scheme to share ventilators. Nor is Donald Trump's willful ignorance of scientific knowledge about the virus likely to lead to his political undoing. It is at least as likely to underwrite his ongoing popularity. In both the UK and the US, the stark light being shone on the inequalities and structural erosions caused by decades of austerity will not mean that these truths can't be shoved quickly back into the closet the moment the crisis of a collapsing NHS and deathly poor funding of public services and service sector provision has been even partially averted. The rhetoric of the household is and will remain central to how we are told to manage to hold these contradictions as though they made sense. We are supposed to be comforted by the return of the family as the baseline unit of the nation and its renewed sexual and gendered authority. We can find pleasure in baking and having the children at home, precisely because these are pre-existing guilty pleasures now authorised as part of the fight against the virus. As long as we gesture towards the horror of that other naturalised feature of gendered households, the battered woman, we can abandon irony for frontline domesticity. If we hesitate or put a spanner in the works, we betray our nation, our communities, each other. We invite a level of wrath reserved for enemies of the state. But queer the pitch we must, and follow Sedgwick's lead. At the level of queer analysis, we could point to an irony of war metaphors that see gender-based violence as collateral damage, or map the risks involved in going home for queer youth. We might point to the costs as costs, the migrant and displaced labour as essential, the austerity wages as unacceptable but core for our contemporary neoliberal and virus-ridden, climate-poor era, as many already have. We might want to refuse to put that knowledge back into the closet afterwards and shout or blow whistles where and when we see that happening. Or we might insist that we take another look at the ways in which the household, as a self-evident place to return to, becomes most salient again, at the very point at which the real care that would make the most difference, that of nurses and doctors in surgeries and hospitals, is revealed again as in critically scarce supply, just like the protection equipment needed to provide that care safely. Affectively, too, we might borrow Sedgwick's raised eyebrow at the ceaseless concern for the isolated elderly, whose loneliness predates this virus lockdown and whose conditions in underfunded care homes or dilapidated council accommodation are similarly likely to disappear as a national scandal once sentimentality is no longer required as a uniting fantasy. Sedgwick wants us to cultivate that refusal, that anger, that calling into view of power, refusing to avert one's gaze, not only as part of critical belief, but as part of the development of alternative knowledge. In 1990, at the height of the AIDS pandemic, Sedgwick also used the viral as a way of valuing alternative epistemologies as well as lives, ones that are devalued, pushed aside, or mocked. Gossip, knowledges needed for survival, lurking instincts. Sedgwick called these nonce taxonomies. They spread rather than move up or down. They ooze and jump horizontally along care capillaries and up and down phone trees. They are the technologies of the powerless that let others know what is safe and what or who should be avoided. For 1990 Sedgwick, nonce taxonomies are not metaphors. They are the knowledges that keep people with AIDS alive within communities. They provide circuits of intimacy that are not rooted in hermetically sealed households, but in chosen family, shared histories, and modes of touching others that have always been innovative. These are knowledges that link poverty, perversion, and racism as always inextricably linked. Sedgwick is writing from a time and place in which contagion meant almost certain death, and she managed to generate a loving, viral epistemology dusted down from the back of that closet whose violences always threaten the most marginal. She understood that to go viral is to challenge heteropatriarchal, racist and classist intimacy paradigms and to keep power abuses in plain sight.